Stalingrad, January 1943. This place is no longer a city. It's a massive, ice-locked graveyard of shattered brick and twisted steel. There are no clear front lines here, no safe zones. Death doesn't give a warning, it just waits. Behind every blown-out window, in every black cellar, under every pile of gray ash. The air is so thick with the smell of soot and cordite that you can almost chew it. But the scariest thing in Stalingrad isn't the roar of the cannons, it's the silence. Because silence here means that right now, a German sniper is slowly taking the slack out of his trigger, looking at the back of your head through his optics. Imagine a guy lying in the dirty, coal-streaked snow. His world has shrunk to a single sound, the rhythmic, crunching step of German boots. 1, 2, 3. They aren't rushing. There's no panic in their movements, only cold calculation. They know he's wounded. They know he has nowhere to go. In his hands, he's holding a single grenade. His fingers, which he can barely feel in the 30 below zero frost, are frozen on the steel ring of the pin. Pull it now and end it all in a second? Or wait until he can feel their breath on his face? This isn't a story of grand offensives. It's a story of decisions made in the mud and blood in a fraction of a second. About how the hunter and the prey switch places in a frozen hell. It all started in the ruins on the edge of the factory district. A scout team was supposed to find a gap in the enemy's defenses. The mission? Go in quiet, observe, and get back. But in Stalingrad, quiet is a relative term. One wrong step, one slippery piece of roofing iron under a boot. A sharp metallic clang cut through the frost, and in that same instant, a German machine gun barked from a black hole in the wall opposite. A lead tracer sewed through the alley, kicking sparks off the stones. The fight lasted 20 seconds, short, dirty, and fatal. 2 scouts fell instantly, their bodies freezing in awkward poses amidst the debris. The third, a young soldier named Alex, was the luckiest of them all. A 7.92 millimeter bullet smashed into his thigh, shattering the bone into splinters. He collapsed into the snow, and for a moment, the world simply ceased to exist. A massive dose of adrenaline turned off the pain for a few seconds, but when he looked down, he saw his pant leg rapidly turning black, soaking with hot blood. In this frost, it was a death sentence. He didn't have a watch, but he felt the invisible timer start. If the Germans didn't finish him now, the cold would. Heat leaves a wounded body with terrifying speed. He forced himself to move. Every inch of the way behind a pile of bricks echoed with a flash of blinding white light in his head. He was alone. His comrades were dead. No radio. And the nearest help was several blocks away. Blocks that, in this city, felt like another planet. He tried to apply a tourniquet, but his fingers had already turned into stiff pieces of wood. The fabric was frozen. The knots slipped from his hands. That was exactly when he heard the crunch of the crust. The Germans worked like professionals. No shouting, no drama. Short, guttural commands, a calm tone, the way people talk in a slaughterhouse. They saw his trail. The blood stripe on the gray snow was as clear as a signpost. They knew he was behind the wall. They knew he was alone. The soldier pulled out his grenade. It was his final argument. In those days, everyone knew the rule: do not surrender. Captivity in Stalingrad in '43 wasn't a camp. It was a slow death in a basement after an interrogation. He understood the Germans needed a tongue. They needed to know who was standing around the next corner. And that made his situation even worse. They didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to take him alive. The footsteps stopped around the corner, 5 meters away. He stopped breathing. He heard one of the Germans flick a lighter. The smell of tobacco mixed with the stench of ruins. It was pure psychological terror. They were waiting for him to break, waiting for a cry of pain or an accidental shot. But he stayed silent. He pressed into the icy brick, feeling the frost suck the last of his strength. His plan was suicidal. Wait until the end and pull the pin when they reached for him. This was his only remaining power, power over how he would leave. One of the Germans shouted in broken Russian, "Hey soldier, come out! We have a doctor! You will live!" The voice sounded unnaturally cheerful, almost mocking. A muffled laugh came in response. They were enjoying this hunt. He gripped the grenade tighter. The metal burned his skin. For a moment, he remembered home. The smell of baked bread, the warmth of his mother's hands. Just 6 months ago, he was a simple kid who was afraid of thunderstorms. And now he's lying in blood, waiting for the enemy to get close enough to blow himself up along with them. Suddenly, the footsteps resumed, sharp, fast. The Germans decided it was time to finish it. One of them lunged around the corner with a submachine gun ready. His face was red from the frost, his eyes cold and empty. Their eyes met. And right then, the soldier realized he had made a mistake. He had waited too long. His hand was so stiff that he couldn't feel the ring. He pulled, but his fingers didn't work. The German smirked, seeing this helpless movement, and stepped forward, slamming his heavy boot directly onto the shattered leg. The pain was so intense that his consciousness almost flickered out. But at that very moment, as the German leaned down to knock the grenade out of his hands, the soldier saw a shadow behind the enemy. Something no one expected to see in this sector. It was the first act of his personal drama. The Germans thought they were the masters of the situation. They forgot that in Stalingrad, the hunter and the prey can switch roles in a heartbeat. And what happened next, no officer of the Wehrmacht could have predicted. The German non-com leaned in with all his weight, grinding his boot into Alex's shattered bone. He wasn't just being cruel, it was a test. A test to see if there was any spine left in the man, or if he had already turned into a submissive mass, ready to give up everything just for the pain to stop. In Alex's eyes, the world flashed white, then faded into a red haze. But this extreme pain, strangely enough, kept him from blacking out entirely. His mind, squeezed in a vice, focused on one goal. The German, seeing that the soldier had stopped resisting, relaxed. He reached for the grenade in Alex's hand, thinking he was already a dead man. It was his first and last mistake. The shadow Alex had noticed behind the enemy's back took form. From a black gap in the wall, as silent as the Stalingrad frost itself, a silhouette in a dirty camouflage suit emerged. It was the sergeant from their group. Alex had thought him dead in the first seconds of the fight, but he had survived, hidden, and waited for the moment. The sergeant didn't shoot. In this sector, a single shot was like a flare that would bring the whole neighborhood running. He simply drove a narrow knife blade under the rim of the German's helmet. It all happened in a terrifying silence. The sergeant jumped toward Alex, throwing the German's dead weight off him. "Get up," he hissed. But he immediately stopped, seeing the state of the leg. "Damn it!" "Go," Alex rasped, clutching the map case to his chest. "In the case, the coordinates, behind the market, in square 44-12, they've deployed heavy howitzers. If we don't hit them before dawn, our positions will be ground into dust." The sergeant didn't answer. He was already hacking at a German uniform sleeve with a knife, making an improvised tourniquet. He tightened it around Alex's thigh so hard that Alex nearly lost consciousness again. "We're not going home," the sergeant snapped. "Too far. I won't be able to carry you, and the Germans will intercept us. There's an old school basement 500 meters from here. Our guys are holding it. There are radio operators. If we crawl there, we'll call in the artillery from there." Imagine this journey. 500 meters. In peacetime, it's a 5-minute stroll. In ruined Stalingrad, with a shattered leg, across open kill zones, it's a distance the human brain refuses to accept as real. But they had no choice. Either they die here in 10 minutes when the Germans come looking for the missing patrol, or they do the impossible. They started moving. The sergeant dragged Alex on his back, gasping from the weight, the cold, and his own fear. Every meter of the path was a small battle. Alex felt his body turning into an icy shell. The only thing keeping him conscious was the map case pressed to his stomach. Inside, on a scrap of paper, were the crosses. Fresh German batteries. the guns that would turn their division into dust tomorrow. After 150 meters, they hit the death strip. 40 meters of open space covered in smooth, bright white ice. On the other side was the skeleton of the school building, dark and ominous. "Listen carefully," the sergeant pressed Alex to the ground in the shadow of a collapsed balcony. "Sniper, he's 100% watching this square. I'll go first. I'll distract him, dart around. As soon as he starts working on me, crawl. Crawl like the life of the whole army depends on it. Because it does." It was a brutal decision. Mathematically correct, but humanly terrifying. The sergeant bolted. He ran in zigzags, diving behind debris, staying low to the snow. The German sniper responded almost instantly. A heavy bullet kicked up a fountain of ice chips 4 inches from the sergeant's heel. A second shot. Miss. The sergeant jumped into the window frame of the school, alive. Now it was Alex's turn. He understood. He couldn't run. He could only crawl, slowly, jerkily, a perfect target on a white background. He started moving. Cold snow packed into his sleeves, burning the open wound. The sniper on the other side wasn't a fool. He waited. He didn't want to waste a bullet on a strange, moving lump. He wanted to know, is it a wounded man or just a piece of tarpaulin being dragged by the wind? The first bullet hit the snow right in front of Alex's face, showering him with ice dust. He froze. His heart was hammering in his throat, pulsing in his wounded leg. The sniper fired again. This time the bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing a chunk of padding from his coat. Alex didn't move. He forced himself to play dead. A minute passed. 2. 5. The frost began to claim him. In Stalingrad, the cold isn't just weather, it's a predator. If he lay there for 10 more minutes, the radio operators wouldn't be able to help him anyway. And at the moment the sniper apparently decided the target was finally done, Alex made a break for it. Using his last strength, on his arms alone, tearing his elbows to blood on the broken brick under the snow, he covered the last 10 meters. The sergeant grabbed him by the collar and literally threw him into the darkness of the basement opening. There, in a damp room smelling of mold and burnt cable, sat 2 men, pale, with eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Radio operators. "Coordinates! Fast!" the sergeant barked. Alex, choking on a cough, pulled out the map case. His fingers were black from frostbite and clotted blood. He pointed to the square behind the market. "There, 3 batteries, at least 18 barrels, heavy howitzers. They're bringing in ammo right now. I saw the trucks." The head operator gripped the handset, his voice trembling, but the words flew out clearly. "Jupiter, this is Falcon 3. Target coordinates, square 4412. Urgent. Group target, enemy heavy artillery. Fire all barrels. I repeat, all barrels. Do not adjust fire on us. Hit the center." Alex lay on the icy floor, listening as somewhere far in the rear, miles away from this hell, the heavy Soviet guns began to thud. A few seconds later, the ground under the school began to shake. This wasn't random shooting. This was a precise, furious strike. 500 meters away, the German batteries, along with their crews and ammo, were turning into a firestorm. The information was passed. The strike was guided. The mission was accomplished. Alex closed his eyes, feeling a strange, deceptive warmth finally spread through his body. He had done everything. But he didn't know yet that the hardest trial was just beginning, because the Germans in the neighboring blocks had already pinpointed where the radio signal came from. And now, clanking their tracks over the broken brick, the Panzer IIIs were moving toward the school with infantry on their hulls. The timer reset. A new countdown began. And this time, there was nowhere to run. The rumble of the cannonade on the horizon began to fade. The artillery strike Alex had guided had done its job. The German batteries behind the market had turned into flaming scrap metal. But here, in the old school sector, a strange, almost sinister silence fell. The Germans who had moved to intercept the radio signal stopped just 2 blocks away from the radio operator's hideout. It was a company of Panzer Grenadiers, supported by 2 PZ-3 tanks. They didn't know the information was already gone. They didn't know their artillery was destroyed. For them, It was just another day in a ruined city where every meter is bought with a fight. The commander of the German detachment, a young lieutenant with a weathered face, raised his hand, ordering them to stop. They decided to take a break. Here, among the ruins of a residential building, a few walls and a deep basement had survived. The Germans were sure this sector had been cleared. The enemy had retreated that morning, and those groups that remained were either destroyed or blocked in basements without ammunition. Look at them. These men made the ultimate mistake in Stalingrad. They relaxed. The soldiers began to unload. Someone leaned his carbine against a piece of wall. Someone sat right on the snowy bricks, trying to rub his numb feet. They pulled out their rations. The smell of canned ham and strong ersatz coffee began to waft through the frost. They laughed, traded jokes, discussing how soon Hitler would finish this campaign and they would return to Germany. At the same time, just 150 meters away, behind a pile of twisted metal, two pairs of eyes watched them. The sergeant and Alex, whom the sergeant had dragged out of the school basement to a better position. "Look at them," the sergeant whispered, barely moving his lips. "Sitting there like they're on a picnic, thinking the city has eaten and digested us." Alex lay on his stomach. His leg was so numb he could hardly feel it, which was actually for the better. The pain didn't interfere with his aim. In his hands was an SVT-40 he had picked up in the school basement. 10 rounds in the magazine, 10 chances to change the course of this night. The situation was paradoxical. The Germans had numerical superiority, tanks, and the warmth of a fire built in the basement. Alex and the sergeant had only the frost, 1 rifle, and a couple of grenades. But they had something the Germans didn't: knowledge of the terrain and the fury of men with nothing left to lose. The Germans made another tactical error. They didn't post sentries around the perimeter, limiting themselves to a couple of men at the entrance to their temporary shelter. Too confident. Too European. In Stalingrad, people paid for such confidence with blood. One of the Germans, apparently a non-commissioned officer, stood up and stretched. He walked a bit away from the fire, toward the corner of the building, right toward the rubble where our guys were hiding. He pulled out a harmonica. A quiet, melancholy melody floated over the ruins. In any other situation it might have seemed beautiful, but here it sounded like a requiem. The sergeant slowly placed a hand on Alex's shoulder. "Wait," he exhaled, barely audible. "Not now. Let the sun set completely. In the twilight, they'll be blind kittens." The timer began to tick again. Every minute of waiting in the 30-degree frost was a risk of simply being unable to pull the trigger. Alex's fingers were turning blue. His breath came out in thin streams of steam. It felt as though the Germans were about to hear his heart beating. But the Germans continued to rest. They began to clean their weapons. Someone even pulled out a deck of cards. They felt like masters. The tankers shut down their engines to save fuel. The metal of the tanks began to cool, making characteristic clicking sounds that carried through the silence. It was this sound, the click of cooling metal, that became the signal. Alex caught the officer in his sights, that same lieutenant who had been giving orders so confidently. He saw him laughing, bringing a mug with a hot drink to his lips. One finger on the trigger. One movement. "Now!" the sergeant commanded. Alex smoothly squeezed the trigger. The loud crack of the shot shattered the silence of the bivouac. The officer dropped his mug. His body slowly slid down the wall. The Germans froze for a split second. This pause was caused by absolute shock. They couldn't believe anyone here would dare to attack. And in that second, the sergeant threw the first grenade right into the center of the fire. The explosion scattered the embers, turning the cozy break into a fiery hell. Cries of the wounded, the stench of singed wool, and panic. The Germans scrambled for their weapons, but in the darkness, blinded by the blast, they started shooting at each other. The break was over. The massacre began. The Germans, who were so sure of their safety, had made the most terrible mistake of their lives. They forgot that in Stalingrad, danger never disappears. It just waits for you to close your eyes. Stalingrad knows how to wait. An hour had passed since the harmonica fell silent, and the Germans sank into that strange, sticky stupor they called rest. In the basement of the semi-ruined house, just 150 meters from the hidden soldiers, life was buzzing. A fire burned, mess tins clattered, laughter was heard. These men felt like victors. They had captured half the city. They had seen the Volga through their binoculars. It seemed to them that war was just a matter of time and logistics. But in Stalingrad, time doesn't work for you. It works against anyone who dares to step on this broken brick. Alex felt the frost finally taking over his body. His wounded leg didn't just ache anymore. It had become foreign, heavy, and icy, like a log. If not for the sergeant, who shook his shoulder every 10 minutes, he would have long since fallen into that sleep you don't wake up from. But they had a goal. The hour they spent motionless was the longest of their lives. They watched the German patrol make mistake after mistake. Look at this patrol. 15 infantrymen, 2 heavy armored cars, a non-com with a map. They acted like they were on a training exercise in Bavaria. They didn't set up rear guards. They parked their vehicles in a way that blocked their own view. They lit a fire that burned like a beacon for death in the nocturnal Stalingrad. "Look," the sergeant whispered, pointing to the sky. "It's starting." The horizon flashed. At first, it looked like heat lightning, silent and distant. But after a few seconds, the air over the ruins began to vibrate. It was a familiar, incomparable sound, a rustle like heavy fabric being torn. Artillery. The very coordinates Alex had passed from the school basement were finally being processed at headquarters. But the shells weren't just flying toward the distant batteries. The division had decided to blanket the whole sector at once to leave the enemy no chance for a counterattack. The first shell landed short, 300 meters from the German camp. The earth shook, throwing up a pillar of black smoke and ice chips. The Germans froze. The laughter stopped. The non-com jumped up, knocking over his mug, and started screaming something, pointing toward the armored cars. But it was too late. Stalingrad logic is simple. If artillery starts working on you, you have 5 seconds to find a deep concrete bunker. These Germans didn't even have 2. The second shell hit the roof of the house where they were warming themselves. The old floors, already battered by shells over months of fighting, gave way. There was a deafening groan of tearing metal and the crack of collapsing stone. A multi-ton avalanche of brick and concrete crashed right into the basement, turning the cozy fire and the sleeping men nearby into one mass grave. Those who managed to scramble out into the street walked into hell. "Now it's our turn," the sergeant raised his rifle. Alex, overcoming the nausea from the pain, pressed his eye to the sight. In the light of the fire that had broken out at the camp, the Germans were visible as if in the palm of a hand. They scurried between the debris, disoriented, stunned, not knowing where the next blow would come from. One of the armored cars tried to turn, its tracks clanking on the ice, but at that moment, a third shell hit its side. The flash was so bright, it became light as day for a second. The car's turret was ripped off and thrown aside, and long tongues of greasy orange flame licked out of the open hatches. This was no longer a war. This was an execution. The Germans who survived the shelling rushed toward the alley, the only escape route. But it was exactly there, in the shadow of twisted beams, that the ambush waited. The sergeant worked methodically. A shot, one falls. A shot, a second stumbles and doesn't get up. Alex caught those trying to organize a defense in his crosshairs. There's a German machine gunner trying to set up his MG on a piece of wall. Alex's finger smoothly presses the trigger. A crack, and the gunner falls backward before he can even load the belt. Panic among the Germans reached its limit. They started shooting in all directions, at the emptiness, at the shadows, at their own reflections in shattered shop windows. They screamed, called for help, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of exploding shells. At one point, one of the Germans, a very young guy without a helmet, his face covered in blood, ran straight toward Alex's hiding place. He wasn't attacking. He was just running from the horror, having thrown away his rifle. He tripped over the body of his comrade, fell, and crawled on all fours, muttering something incoherently. Alex saw him through the sight. He saw his pupils dilated with madness. At that moment, there was no ideology, no great Germany or Soviet Union. There was just one small, broken man who wanted to live. Alex hesitated for a moment. His finger froze. But then he remembered the look of that non-com who had been grinding his leg into the mud an hour ago. He remembered his comrades who were left lying in the snow at the start of this journey. He remembered that these people didn't come here in peace. Shot. The German thudded face first into the snow. The shelling continued for another 10 minutes. When the dust and smoke settled a bit, nothing living was left of the German patrol. 2 smoldering piles of metal, a collapsed basement, and 15 bodies scattered in the most bizarre poses throughout the alley. The whole patrol that had been so confidently drinking coffee and playing the harmonica had ceased to exist. Alex leaned back, breathing heavily. The steam from his breath mixed with the smoke of the fire. The sergeant walked over to him, sat down, and silently pulled out a pouch of tobacco. His hands were shaking too. "That's it," the sergeant said quietly. "They're gone. The information went through, the artillery worked. We're clear." The feeling of victory was strange. There was no joy, no celebration. There was only a scorched emptiness inside, and the realization of how thin the line is that separates the hunter from the corpse. An hour ago, these Germans thought they were the gods of this city. Now they were just part of the Stalingrad landscape, cold meat no one needed. "We need to move." The sergeant stood up and began to hoist Alex onto his shoulder. "Others will come here soon. The Germans won't forgive the loss of an entire patrol and batteries." They began their journey back. Alex looked over his shoulder at the smoldering school, at the wrecked tanks. He understood that this was just one small scene in the massive play of war. But it was right here, in this nameless alley, that the fate of hundreds of people was decided. People who would go into the attack tomorrow on a bridgehead cleared of German artillery. The price was high. A shattered leg, killed friends, and another notch on the heart. But when they crawled to the first line of their own trenches, and Alex saw the surprised, then joyful faces of his own people, he understood. Every decision, every second of pain, every shot in the dark, it all had meaning. Stalingrad continued to burn. But today, it wasn't them who burned in that fire. Today, the overconfidence of those who thought this city was theirs burned in that fire. The timer of their lives had stopped, and Alex, against all laws of logic and medicine, continued to breathe. The sky over Stalingrad began to lighten, taking on a heavy, leaden hue. It was the dawn of February 2nd, 1943, the day when a silence that was no longer scary finally hung over the ruins of the city. It was the silence of surrender. Alex lay in the back of a truck carrying the wounded to the rear, on the other side of the Volga. His leg had been amputated at the hip. The frost and the shattered bone left the doctors no choice. He watched the receding silhouette of the city, which in these few days had become both a cradle and a grave for him. Beside him sat the sergeant. He was whole, except for a scorched face and eyes in which, it seemed, everything living had burned out. They were silent. In moments like these, words are not needed. They both knew the price of this silence. There, in the alley behind the old school, under a layer of fresh snow and ash, more than just 15 German soldiers and 2 tanks remained. Something more remained there. Look at this finale through the eyes of history. Alex didn't become a hero of newspaper headlines. His name wasn't carved on the main monuments. He returned to his village on one leg, with a map case that had once held the lives of hundreds of people and now held only old letters. But every night, closing his eyes, he heard that sound again, the crunch of snow under a German boot. He felt the cold of the grenade in his hand again and saw the face of that young German who ran toward him, seeking salvation, and found death. This is the true face of war. It isn't medals and parades. It is a human decision made in the mud when you are scared, weak, and abandoned by everyone. The mistake of a German officer who decided to have a smoke 2 meters away from the enemy. The resolve of a sergeant who didn't abandon his friend. The persistence of a mangled kid who, instead of just dying, chose to crawl and guide the fire. Millions of such small, invisible decisions added up to one big victory. But every victory has scars. The sergeant died 2 months later near Kharkov. Alex lived a long life, becoming a history teacher in a village school. He never told his students about how he killed. He told them about how important it is to remain human, even when the world around you turns into Stalingrad. Sometimes, on the anniversary of those battles, he would go out onto the porch, watch the falling snow, and listen. It seemed to him that somewhere out there, in the infinite silence of time, the melancholy melody of a harmonica still sounds, suddenly cut short by the loud crack of a gunshot. The hunter and the prey have long since turned to dust, but the choice they made that night remained inscribed in the foundation of this city. The choice to fight to the end, even if you have nothing but a single grenade and the will to live. Stalingrad taught the world much, but the main lesson was simple. Never consider the enemy defeated until you have looked into his eyes. And never think that one man in the field isn't a warrior, because sometimes that man is all that stands between peace and the abyss. The timer has stopped. Alex's story is complete, but the echo of his feet will sound for as long as we remember the price of every step across this red snow. I hope this script serves your YouTube project well. Would you like me to help with a hook for the video description or tags to improve the algorithm's reach?